I want you to imagine a president announcing a policy to create a blue-collar boom for American workers. Now imagine that within 8 months, that exact policy destroys 67,000 American manufacturing jobs.
Sounds like political malpractice, right? That's precisely what happened with Trump's tariffs on Canada. And here's the part that should make your blood boil. The justification he gave, that Canada is flooding America with fentanyl, accounts for exactly 0.2% of seized fentanyl at U.S. borders.
Not 20%, not 2%, 0.2%.
While headlines focused on Trump's threats to make Canada the 51st state, something far more consequential was happening. American factories were quietly shutting down. Canadian workers were losing jobs by the tens of thousands. And a 75-year partnership, the most integrated trade relationship on Earth, was being ripped apart based on lies that even a federal court has now declared illegal. The cost? $160 billion to Canada's economy, $1,200 more per year for every American household. And a recession that economists are now calling the Trump recession. This isn't a story about tough negotiations. This is a story about economic vandalism disguised as patriotism. Before we dive deeper, if you find this kind of analysis valuable, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and share this with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world.
I'm Robert Reich. I spent 45 years working on economics, labor policy, and economic inequality.
And I've seen firsthand how rising inequality, weakening labor rights, and the increasing influence of corporations shape American democracy. Today, I want to explain what's really going on here. Who benefits? Who pays the price? And how the underlying economic forces are shaping these outcomes. Because what you're being told and what's actually happening are two very different things. Here's the story you were told. On January 20th, 2025, Trump returned to office, promising an America First trade policy. Within 2 weeks, he announced 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, claiming this was necessary to stop the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants into the United States. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. America does have a fentanyl crisis. Over 100,000 people die annually from drug overdoses, and fentanyl is the primary killer. If Canada is allowing drugs to pour across the border, shouldn't we do something about it? The rhetoric went like this. Trump tweeted, "This tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country." He later added, "We don't need their cars. We don't need their energy. We don't need their lumber. We don't need anything that they give." The intended message was clear. Canada has been taking advantage of America for decades. They're dumping products here, creating a massive trade deficit, and refusing to secure their border. The tariffs would force them to change. And for many people, that narrative was enough. After all, Trump campaigned on getting tough with trade partners. He promised to bring manufacturing jobs back. He said tariffs would protect American workers from unfair competition. But here's the problem. Every single major claim in that narrative is false. And I'm not talking about spin or interpretation. I'm talking about objective, verifiable lies that even a federal court has now exposed. To understand how spectacularly this backfired, you need to start with the fentanyl justification, because it's completely fabricated. Here's the data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. In 2024, federal agents seized 43 pounds of fentanyl at the Canadian border. That represents 0.2% of all fentanyl intercepted at U.S. borders. At the Mexican border, 21,148 pounds. That's 96.6% of the total. Let me make this concrete. For every 1 pound of fentanyl coming from Canada, 492 pounds come from Mexico. Even more revealing, the Congressional Commission on Combating Synthetic Opioid Trafficking concluded in 2022, before Trump's campaign, that Canada is not known to be a major source of fentanyl, other synthetic opioids, or precursor chemicals to the United States. This isn't opinion. This is the U.S. government's own commission telling us that Canada is not the problem. And here's the kicker. Fentanyl deaths in the United States have been declining by over 30% since 2023. Trump is using outdated data to justify a crisis that's actually improving. So, if the fentanyl justification is false, what about the trade deficit? Trump has repeatedly claimed that the United States has a $200 billion deficit with Canada. He said this in speeches, interviews, and official statements. The actual number? $40.6 billion when you count both goods and services. If you only count goods, it's $72.3 billion. Trump inflated the deficit by 3 to 5 times. But even calling it a deficit is misleading, because the largest component of U.S. imports from Canada is oil and natural gas, energy that American refineries and power plants desperately need. We're not being taken advantage of. We're buying discounted energy that keeps our economy running. Here's what you need to understand about trade deficits. They're not inherently bad. A trade deficit means Americans are consuming more than they're producing, which can indicate a strong economy with high consumer demand. And in the case of Canada, we're trading dollars for critical resources we don't have enough of domestically. But Trump doesn't care about economic nuance. He sees a number, inflates it, and uses it to justify whatever policy he wants. Now, here's where the consequences become impossible to ignore. Trump promised these tariffs would create a blue-collar boom. He said American manufacturing would surge. Jobs would come flooding back. Within 4 months of the tariffs taking effect on March 4, 2025, 67,000 American manufacturing jobs disappeared. That's not Canadian jobs, that's American jobs, in American factories, making products for American consumers. Let me explain the mechanism. Modern manufacturing, especially in automotive, which is the largest sector affected, relies on integrated supply chains. A car assembled in Michigan contains parts that cross the U.S.-Canada border 6 or 7 times during production. Canadian steel is turned into American engine blocks. American electronics are assembled into Canadian dashboard systems. The final product is built in the U.S. and sold globally. This integration exists because it's efficient. It keeps costs down and quality up. When Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian imports, he didn't protect American manufacturers from competition. He cut them off from essential inputs they can't easily replace. Here's a concrete example. Stellantis operates a plant in Brampton, Ontario, employing 3,000 Canadian workers building Jeep Compass vehicles. In October 2025, Stellantis announced it's closing that plant and moving production to Illinois. At first glance, that looks like a win for Trump. Jobs moving to America, right? Wrong. Stellantis didn't move because the tariffs made Canadian labor less attractive. They moved because the tariffs made it impossible to profitably export vehicles from Canada to the U.S. market. The company had to choose: shut down entirely or consolidate in the U.S. But here's what Trump doesn't tell you.
Stellantis also cut 900 jobs at American plants that supplied the Canadian facility.
The integrated supply chain meant that when Canada got hurt, American suppliers got hurt too. And that pattern repeated across dozens of industries.
In July 2025 alone, Canada lost 40,800 jobs. The unemployment rate hit 6.9%, the highest in years. Youth unemployment reached 14.6%, levels not seen since the 1990s.
Meanwhile, American consumers are paying more for everything from cars to construction materials.
The Tax Foundation estimates the average American household will pay $1,200 more in 2025 and $1,400 more in 2026 because of these tariffs. This is the exact opposite of what Trump promised. Instead of bringing jobs back, the tariffs are destroying them on both sides of the border. Instead of protecting American workers, they're making everything more expensive while reducing employment. So who actually pays for this catastrophic policy? Not who Trump told you. First, there are the direct victims, workers who lost their jobs. Canadian auto workers, 3,000 at Stellantis Brampton alone. Another 4,500 at Windsor Assembly placed on temporary layoff. These aren't abstract statistics. These are families who suddenly can't pay mortgages, can't afford college tuition, can't plan for the future, because their government's closest ally decided to use them as economic hostages. American manufacturing workers. 67,000 jobs lost since the tariffs took effect. Steel fabricators in Ohio who can't afford the suddenly expensive Canadian inputs they need. Parts suppliers in Michigan whose customers in Canada went bankrupt. These workers voted for Trump in many cases, believing he'd protect their jobs. Instead, his policy destroyed them. Young workers on both sides. Youth unemployment in Canada hit 14.6%. For young Americans trying to enter manufacturing, opportunities are evaporating as plants close or freeze hiring. Then there are the indirect victims, American consumers. That $1,200 per household isn't optional. It's baked into the prices you pay for cars, appliances, building materials, food. Economists call these pass-through costs. The tariff gets paid by importers who raise prices, which consumers ultimately bear. Small businesses. A construction company in Texas that suddenly pays 25% more for Canadian lumber. A furniture maker in North Carolina whose costs spiked because Canadian wood products are now prohibitively expensive. These businesses can't absorb those costs. They either raise prices, losing customers, or lay off workers. And here's something most coverage misses. The Canadian economy is so dependent on U.S. trade that when Canada hurts economically, American exporters hurt too. Canada buys $360 billion in American goods and services annually. When Canadians have less money, they buy fewer American products. This isn't a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses. It's a negative-sum game where both sides lose. Now here's where it gets interesting. While tens of thousands of workers suffer, who actually benefits? Stellantis executives. Notice the pattern here. The benefits are concentrated among a small number of powerful actors. Large corporations that can extract subsidies, financial speculators who profit from volatility, and geopolitical rivals who benefit from American self-sabotage. The costs are dispersed across millions of powerless people. Workers who lose jobs, consumers who pay higher prices, small businesses that go bankrupt, communities that see factories close. This is textbook political economy. In policy debates, Concentrated benefits with organized advocates almost always defeat dispersed costs borne by the disorganized masses. Why? Because Stellantis executives lobby aggressively. Financial traders donate to campaigns, but a laid-off auto worker in Brampton or a fabricator in Ohio has no such voice. And that's precisely what makes bad policy politically sustainable, until the job losses become so widespread that even the political calculus shifts. We may be reaching that point now, because 67,000 American jobs is a lot, and federal courts are paying attention too. This isn't the first time Trump has tried this playbook. Remember the 2018 tariffs on steel and aluminum? Trump imposed those, claiming national security. They were supposed to revitalize American manufacturing. What actually happened? American manufacturers who use steel, car companies, appliance makers, construction firms, saw their costs spike. They passed those costs to consumers. Some laid off workers. And after 2 years of economic pain, Trump quietly removed most of the tariffs. Sound familiar? The pattern is always the same. Announce dramatic tariffs with nationalist rhetoric. Ignore warnings from economists. Watch as the policy backfires. Double down for a while. Then either quietly retreat while declaring victory, or escalate further to avoid admitting failure. The result then was a $28 billion bailout for American farmers hurt by retaliation. The result now is 67,000 American jobs lost and counting. The common thread is a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern trade works, treating economic integration as if it's a zero-sum contest, rather than a mutually beneficial system. Here's something most Americans don't know yet. On May 28, 2025, the U.S. Court of International Trade declared Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose these tariffs illegal. Let me explain what that means. Trump didn't use the normal trade law processes that require congressional input and allow for judicial review. Instead, he invoked IEEPA, a law designed for genuine national security emergencies like terrorist threats or war. The court looked at Trump's justification, the fentanyl crisis that accounts for 0.2% of seized drugs, and essentially said, this is not an emergency. This is a fabricated pretext for an economic policy Congress never authorized. The Trump administration is appealing to the Supreme Court, which will probably rule on partisan lines. But even conservative legal scholars have expressed doubt about whether Trump's use of IEEPA can survive scrutiny. What this means practically is that every company, worker, and consumer affected by these tariffs has been harmed by a policy that a federal court has declared illegal. That opens the door to lawsuits, compensation claims, and eventually, political accountability. But zoom out further. What does this do to American credibility? Canada has been America's closest ally for 75 years. We share the longest peaceful border in history. We fought together in every major conflict since World War I. Our economies are so integrated that over $2.5 billion in goods crosses the border every single day. And Trump just told Canada, we don't need anything you give. Become the 51st state or suffer economically. What message does that send to other allies? If the U.S. is willing to economically attack Canada, its most reliable partner, over fabricated pretexts, why would any other country trust American commitments? Japan, South Korea, the European Union, they're all watching, and they're all quietly hedging, diversifying supply chains, strengthening ties with other partners, building systems that don't depend on American stability. Companies don't forget this kind of volatility. When your business model depends on predictable trade rules, And those rules can change overnight based on a president's whim. You adjust. You build redundancy. You prepare exit strategies. 5 years from now, the real cost won't be the 67,000 jobs lost in 2025. It'll be the decades of integrated partnership that are quietly unraveling. Partnerships that took generations to build and can't be rebuilt with a tweet. So what's the takeaway here? This isn't really a story about tariffs or fentanyl or trade deficits. This is a story about what happens when policy is built on lies and driven by ego rather than expertise. Trump inflated a $40 billion trade deficit to $200 billion. He fabricated a fentanyl crisis where 0.2% became a lot. He promised a blue-collar boom and delivered 67,000 lost American jobs. And even after a federal court declared his actions illegal, he's doubling down. The lesson? You cannot build functioning policy on false premises. Eventually, reality asserts itself. Markets react. Jobs disappear. Courts intervene. And the people who pay the price are never the ones who made the decisions. Here's what troubles me most. The people making these decisions, Trump, his trade advisors, the political appointees, they aren't the ones paying the price. When Stellantis closes the Brampton plant, Trump doesn't lose his job. When a steel fabricator in Ohio goes bankrupt, Howard Lutnick still gets his salary. When American families pay $1,200 more per year, the billionaires who benefit from market chaos get richer. That's not just unfair, it's economically destructive. Because when consequences and decisions are separated, when the people wielding power face no accountability for the harm they cause, you get exactly what we're seeing now. Reckless policies that enrich a few while devastating millions. Could this have been avoided? Absolutely. Responsible trade policy starts with facts, not fabrications. It accounts for supply chain integration. It recognizes that allies are partners, not adversaries. It acknowledges that tariffs are taxes paid by your own citizens, not foreign governments. Will lessons be learned? If history is any guide, Trump will either escalate until the political costs become unbearable, or quietly retreat while claiming victory. Meanwhile, 67,000 American workers and 140,000 Canadian workers will still be out of jobs. The question isn't whether Trump will admit failure. The question is how much more damage will be done before reality forces a course correction. And that answer will determine whether this is remembered as a painful but temporary mistake, or as the moment America permanently damaged its most important alliance. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure you're subscribed. I'll be following this story as it develops, especially the Supreme Court case that could determine whether Trump's tariffs were illegal all along. Share this with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening behind the headlines. And tell me in the comments, have these tariffs affected your job, your community, or your cost of living? I want to hear your stories. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.